Hey, Canucks fans, I'm very excited to have Iain MacIntyre here as my guest. We figured out like 2 or 3 minutes apart from each other. We grew up in the same area, went to the same high school. I won't say who's older, but I'm just thrilled that Iain has taken the time to join us. The Canucks have finally, their first 2-day break between games this entire season gave Iain and I a chance to catch up a little bit. So Iain, welcome and thanks for joining me tonight.
Well, it's nice to be on with you, Clay, and I think it's pretty obvious to everyone watching who's older. I've got you by a few years now. Haven't asked you though. Do you have older siblings?
No, I'm the oldest of two. Just my younger brother Jason, who's 2 years younger than me. Yeah.
Okay, because being a few years ahead of you at the same schools, I wonder if maybe I'd gone to school with an older brother or a sister.
Yeah.
But
it's okay. Maybe the next generation will be closer in age. We will see.
So is Emu one of the old Richmond names?
It is. We grew up in Steveston. Our family was interned in World War II to Greenwood. And, it's funny you mentioned last name. My cousin Dusty, you may have seen his name. He's a goalie coach that He did 2 years in Winnipeg, 4 years in LA, the most recent year with Kunlun Red Star in the KHL. And, I know he's got his eye on maybe Seattle or any other jobs. But yeah, my cousin Dusty he was the one who made headlines 3 years ago when he backed up his younger son, Jonah, when the LA Kings were going through all these goalie injuries. So I'm only the second most popular emo in hockey, in the hockey world.
Well, number 2 is pretty good.
I
don't know where I am in MacIntyre's, but there's not many of us over in this country. Most are in Scotland. But that's interesting that your family is one of the old Steveston families.
They are indeed.
I live now, I mean, the realtors call it Steveston, but it's not really Steveston. But I've always lived in this area of Richmond, grew up here, moved away at times for work and lived in Vancouver for a while. But Steveston always feels like home. But it absolutely breaks my heart and never fails to make me feel shame when I think about what happened to the Japanese during World War II, Canadian Japanese. And, some of those families were responsible for the founding of my community and it breaks my heart, but a lot of history there for you and your family then.
Well, I appreciate that, Iain. And when we're allowed to, when this COVID thing ends, you and I, we can just meet on Steveston Highway, take a walk down to Steveston and grab a coffee. I think that'll be pretty cool.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that, Iain. So let's get into it. Today, obviously a sad day in the local sports media and maybe national as well. Your reaction to the news that Bell Media pulled the plug on TSN 1040 today?
Well, like everybody else, I was just stunned because you'd like to think that you see these things coming, but often you don't see what's coming in life. And I just feel awful for those guys. Before I was hired by Sportsnet, and I spent a lot of my career at the Vancouver Sun, most of my career at the Vancouver Sun as a columnist there, but I was a regular contributor to TSN, and even before that, the team 1040. And so I know those guys, and I know how hard they've worked. I know how talented they are. And so it's just sad all around. Maybe it seems so often now people, and especially on social media, when somebody has stepped out of line, or there seems to be this rush, well, let's try and get somebody fired or have someone removed. And I just think that for all these people who have families and kids, and all they're really trying to do is do a job that they love and they do well, covering sports, which they have a passion for, and basically trying to support themselves, support their families. Like, nobody is really getting rich in this business. Nobody gets into it for that. Otherwise, they're awfully naive.
Yeah.
So I just think
same idea.
So I just think it's just sad because I don't just think of, the employees who lose their jobs, but I think of how that impacts their families and in fact impacts their mental health and, the worries that a lot of them now will have for the future, both in their profession, but also in their personal life. So it's a really tough day. Our business is increasingly difficult. I saw firsthand before I joined Sportsnet in 2017, sort of the devastation of newspapers. And that's, that's kind of representative of a societal shift. But there were also mistakes that papers made, and there were things that happened that were beyond their control, like, Google taking content and charging ads for Vancouver Sun stories, essentially.
Yeah.
And I've just seen a lot of downsizing constantly, and there's always this little bit of fear in the business about where it's going to go next. So I just feel badly for all those guys. It's a really difficult time.
Well said. Thank you, Iain. And yeah, referencing the your days with the Vancouver Sun as well. So I want to break this chat into two parts. I want to talk for a few minutes about what it's like to cover the team this year, and then we'll get into the team itself. So how would you describe covering the team this season, this COVID-laden season?
Well, if there wasn't a pandemic, covering the team right now would be, I'm going to say, unlike anything I've ever covered. And I've been on the Canucks beat for close to 30 years, which again is indicative of my age. But I started when I was 12, so it's okay. Because I can't think of another time where there was so much optimism and hope based on the previous season, and then the team disappointing. The only thing that I can think that would be comparable is around 96, I think it was summer of 96, the Canucks acquired Alex Mogilny.
Yeah.
And they still had all the key pieces from the 94 Stanley Cup team, and now they're bringing in Mogilny. I think they added Russ Courtnall, who was a terrific fast player, Jeff Courtnall's brother, of course. And there just was so much optimism about that team. And then it absolutely cratered. And I think it was the season after that, Pat Quinn got fired. There was the Mike Keenan chaos.
Messier
was brought in. And it was just, people were stunned because the team so drastically underperformed expectations. And a lot of people ended up being traded. Several lost their jobs. And I don't know where this season is going, but it has a similar feel so far. It's only been 16 games, and that's the saving grace. It's not 82 games yet. But then on top of the team underperforming so far, you have the pandemic and how strange it is to cover everything on Zoom. And you can, I'm fortunate I can get inside Rogers Arena and I can watch games and watch practices, but I don't get near the ice, and I certainly don't get near players. And more than ever, I feel like this is a time where I wish I could build and exercise the relationships I have with the guys on the team who I know through time covering them. I have been here long enough that, I've been here when every player has arrived, and I've been here when most have left so far. And during that time, for the most part, I think I earn enough respect that I can have conversations with them. And they're not only on the record interviews, but I can try to find out when something's not right. I can try to find out why it's not right, and get some honest assessment from the players about what they think. And of course, that's impossible right now because we don't reach out. That's not the protocol. Right. And the numbers, there's a few guys, I do have their phone numbers, but I don't text or press them for information because I feel like that's abusing the relationship. So it is hard. It's hard right now because there's so much stress and pressure around the team. They know they're underperforming. We all know they're underperforming. There's a lot of tension and angst. And I can't, as a reporter, I can't get to the bottom of it. And that part is very frustrating. But as I said, it's only 16 games. They have 40 to go, which is only the equivalent of half of a regular season. It's going to be awfully hard to catch up, in a 56 game schedule, but they still have time. They just have to start playing better, and then we'll see what happens with results. They just haven't played well enough.
Yeah. I vlogged about it today. I think if they want to get to 64, 65 points, they got to go something like 23, 11, and 6 going forward, which is a tall tale. So let's get, we'll get back to the Canucks in a second. I want to ask you two quick media questions. Number one, Iain, you said you've been covering on this beat for 25 to 30 years. Has your writing style changed at all, for better or for worse, in those 30 years?
Hopefully I've learned something. So hopefully the writing's a little bit better. You do, especially, and I think it's this way no matter what field you're in, early on in your career, if you have an aptitude for what you're doing, you should get pretty good at it. You know, your improvement should be, your learning curve is steep initially, but so is your improvement. So the writing itself, I don't think has changed. Hopefully I'm a little more refined. I've always tried to infuse stories with humor as well as context. And I've always tried to be fair. I guess what's changed is just there's so many more voices in the market. You know, when I started a typical game day, you know, there'd be 2 newspaper reporters, CKNW radio, maybe BC TV would have a camera. Depending if there was a hockey night in Canada game coming up, CBC might have a camera. But you could count easily on 2 hands, and sometimes you only needed one, the number of reporters who were in the dressing room with the team, say after a game day skate. And now even in the regular season, under normal non-pandemic times, that number, there'd be 30 people in the dressing room. If it's a big game, there's 40. If there's playoffs, there's more. There's numerous cameras and everybody is recording. And so the dynamics with the players has really changed because they now see the dressing room as kind of a hostile area. You know, it's an area to get through with as little inconvenience and damage as possible. I think that's how a lot of them view it. Whereas when I started, that room was very much their room. They were at ease in the dressing room and they were at ease being around reporters. And it was an entirely different dynamic then as far as the relationships that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. It was far different then. There was a lot of accountability both ways. You know, players all read, they all knew exactly what I'd written about them. And they didn't hesitate to chide me, criticize me, occasionally scream at me because of it, but in a way that was healthy too. And I think that there's nothing wrong with people on my side of the microphone or the notepad being held accountable for the things we say and the things we write, because it would be hypocritical of us to complain otherwise, since we're holding others accountable. The other way that the market has changed, and this is probably more the last 10 to 15 years, and as with the rise of social media, there's so many more people who are blogging about the team, so many more people who have access to an audience and can build an audience, and that's great. But it's also brought, I'm going to choose my word carefully here, a little more extremism, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad sense. But there just through sheer number, there's far more divergent opinion now. And at times, and you know, when you don't have the advantages that I have in terms of access to players and coaches and information and, you know, being able to do my job as a trained journalist firsthand, there's been the rise of the hot takes. And you know, again, there's nothing wrong with that. And it's not that hot takes are bad, but you know, by definition, you're trying to be not outrageous, that's not the right word, but you're trying to catch attention.
You're trying to incite a reaction.
Right. In a way, in the newspaper terms, it's like more tabloid media, more sensational, more outlandish, maybe on occasion outrageous is the right word. But so the market has just become a little more extreme, I would say. I've tried to continue to do the job the same way as I did when I started. At times now that gets me positioned as kind of the house guy, or I'm soft on the Canucks. I'm actually, I think, consistently critical. If people actually read what I write every day, I'm consistently critical, but I always strive to be fair.
Yeah.
And I know through the years, whether it was Pat Quinn, whether it was, I mean, Mike Keenan wasn't here very long, but he was upset with me at times. Mark Crawford, even Elaine Vigneault. There's always been people who are angry at what I've written, but I think lately there's other people that they're more angry with, maybe because of the views. But you know what? That's partly why our market is so great for fans, because there is this divergence of opinions and a lot of views, and that's healthy. That's better than having one view or two views trying to set the tone for the entire market. So it's interesting, but things have shifted for sure.
I love your point about there's this space now that's being created for content creators. Heck, you're talking about a guy who claims he's the founder of a fictitious club of positivity. But yes, I know exactly what you're saying. One last question about the media. Then we can talk about.
Let me jump back, and I can give you sort of a comparable, and I won't say the name of the player who told me this, but this was it was before the lockout in 05, where size was so still valued, and the league is, by the way, the hockey's never been better. In the time I've covered, it's never been better than what it is now. Like, the amount of skill and speed in the game is fantastic. But back then, there was still this emphasis on size, and it was an older player, and he said, I came into the league as a big, mean power forward, and I'm going to go out as a small, shifty center.
Wow.
And what he meant was the game had gotten so much bigger around him, and the way it was played and the way it was coached and the sheer size of guys, that he was like this and the whole league kind of went like this.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like that way as a journalist, that I'm still trying to do the job as I've always done it, but things have kind of shifted around me, and it's probably that way again. It's probably that way in all walks of life. Nothing stays the same, right? Everything evolves.
Evolves, exactly. One last media question, Iain. Thank you for that. Is you write it for Sportsnet. You can do 1,500, 2,000, whatever it is, 2,500 words. Takes a 7 to 8 minute read. Whereas on TV during their intermissions, it's a quick 3 or 4 minute hit, and you're often sharing that hit with someone else sometimes. Is that the biggest change? Is it more of a thinking on your feet, or what's the biggest difference between writing a story post game versus being on for an intermission for 3 or 4 minutes?
Well, they're hugely different undertakings, and normally post game I'm writing 800 to 1,000 words. If I'm getting up 1,500 to 2,000, that's into feature territory.
Okay. Sure. Maybe I read slow.
But I'm more comfortable doing the 800 words, even though I might only have 45 minutes to do it, than trying to speak for 3 minutes with Dan Murphy. Murph is fantastic, by the way, and he runs the show, and we talk and we come up with topics, but we don't rehearse and we don't script, and there's no teleprompter. So, and that's by design. Well, I don't think Sportsnet's never offered us a teleprompter, but it's by design that we don't rehearse, because as it was explained to me when I started, because I'm not a TV guy, I probably everyone out there is nodding their head like, yeah, we know that you're not a TV guy. But when I started, I got advice that I thought was very good, that if you rehearse, then when you go live on television, and it is live, we're not taping, it's happening in real time, you sometimes then start to try to remember what it was you were rehearsing, instead of just letting kind of your feelings and your thoughts flow. So we don't rehearse, which for the most part, I guess, is good. Sometimes in hindsight, I wish we had, but it's challenging. And luckily, the team that I work with is so exceptionally good, and not just Dan and broadcasters, Brendan and Corey and John on the TV side, but the directors and the people in the truck and the people who are helping with the tech stuff, that everybody tries to make it as easy for me as possible. And yet I still screw it up sometimes, but it is very different. I get more,
Yeah.
I still to this day, even though I've been doing television a few years now with Dan on these intermission panels, I still get more nervous and worried about those 3-minute hits than I do about writing 800 or 1,000 words after the game.
Well, I appreciate the humility and the honesty. It's funny that you mentioned that about rehearsing versus spontaneous for my little daily, my vlogs for the Canucks I do in my car. Same thing. I just press record on my iPhone. I don't edit. I don't do any post-production. And I do find that my takes are more raw, more honest. And it's not hot takes. It's just simply me trying to talk off the top of my head. And sometimes it brings out the neat things. And other times, it brings out, it just brings out, I think, a more honest and vulnerable position if that's what I'm going for, kind of thing. So I really like that response.
You know what? Honesty is never a bad thing. In fact, it's the foundation of what we should be doing. If we can't actually be honest and know that we're being honest with ourselves and our audience, then we shouldn't be doing this. So hopefully people see the honesty and can put up with the little bit of roughness around the edges sometimes with which it's delivered.
Love it. So your latest article, the one after last night's 3-1 loss against Toronto, I love your opening line. The Vancouver Canucks showed Monday they had a pulse. Now they have to prove their team is actually alive. Do you think the Canucks did enough last night, Iain? Well, 2 nights ago now, people will be watching this on Wednesday. Did they do enough on Monday night to actually gain some momentum and forge some positives going forward?
Well, I guess we'll know on Thursday, and we'll know in the next 3 games. I thought it was important that they had to elevate their intensity and their effort level. And really, what were we all talking about in those 4 games that they lost? It wasn't just that they lost the games. It wasn't even their record necessarily. It was how they were playing and how badly they were losing, and how after the first game in Toronto that they lost 7-3, there was no response. In the next game that they lost 5-1, there was no energy. As I wrote, there was no defiance in the Canucks, even though they were down by 5 goals in the third period. And of course, at the end of that game, Braden Holtby came on Zoom for reporters and said, he was asked about the interaction with Miller during the game, and he said, well, it stays on the ice. But then he said, as veteran players, when you have a bad game, you have to come ready to play the next game. Like, you have to have a response. And whether you win or lose, you don't know, but you have to have a response. I think basically that earned him a start, because it's been a long time since we've had a Canuck player basically put himself out there that way. And I thought it was a really important message about the team. I think the whole discussion about the Miller Holtby interaction, that's all about internal accountability, which is incredibly important. Anybody who's ever played on a sports team understands, right? Here's the order that it matters when people are critical of you. Reporters last, maybe not, but near the bottom. Friends or associates, that doesn't matter. Parents, by the time you get to the NHL, you probably compartmentalize that. That doesn't matter. The general manager, you should pay attention to him, but he's a little bit removed from the team itself. The coach, well, now you got to worry about what the coach says. The players, your teammate, when guys get on you on your team, you better pay attention because there's something wrong. If they're telling you, there's something wrong. And so I thought that level of internal accountability, what it represented, was really important. So in that context, having the game that they had on Monday, where they outplayed the best team in the NHL in the first 2 periods, outshot them 27-7. And granted, I'm sure the Maple Leafs would say they weren't at their best, they needed to be better, yada, yada, yada. But compare that to what had happened the previous 2 games. They still lost the game. They needed a better third period. They gave up the 2 goals in 11 seconds, both of which were preventable. But at least they had the intensity and the engagement, because if they don't have that, nothing else matters. If they have that every game, they're probably going to win a bunch, and maybe they climb back into this race. But if they don't have that, if they play like they had the first two games in Toronto, the first game in Montreal, even the second game in Montreal wasn't great. They were kind of close, but it still wasn't a performance urgency anywhere near what they showed in that third game in Toronto.
Yeah.
If you play that way, you got no chance. But if they can play more often like they did on Monday, then they have a chance. But they now have to show it, right?
Yeah.
It was one game. They've played poorly a lot more of these first 16 than they played well. So that was one game. Let's see if they can make it 2, 3, 4. And then if they can do that, if they can play 4 or 5 games in a row with that kind of intensity and urgency, whether they win or lose, then I'll say that this is kind of a turning point, at least in attitude, that it's got the players' attention and they're now more focused. But if they go back to how they were, they got no chance. They got no chance.
Is it too simple to say, Ian, that the Canucks are struggling because Pettersson, Hughes, and Miller, among three of their best players, are not playing like their best players, or is it deeper or more complicated than that?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons, and generally things are complicated. Very rarely in life, in anything, is there a lone gunman that you can point to and say it's that and only that. Of course, it always makes us feel better if that's all it is, if it's a lone gunman, because then you take care of that one guy or that one problem, and you can sleep better at night. Everything's fixed. It was all just him. It's not just those 3 guys, but certainly that's a big part of it. That their best players haven't been good enough. But and they're the 3 best players on the team, but even beyond them, Bo Horvat started really well. He hasn't been as good lately, although there's never an issue with Bo's effort and the intensity with which he is playing. On defense, Alex Edler had his best game on Monday, but there's been games he hasn't been very good. Nate Schmidt has had a really difficult transition, and surprisingly, he's had a difficult transition. So it's not only those 3 guys. There's a lot of blame to go around, but they're so important to the team. They're such dynamic players. Miller himself is such a leader figure on this team, more so now that they don't have Tanev and Stetcher anymore and Markstrom anymore. That Miller's leadership's even more important. So those guys do have to figure out a way. I think Pettersson has come a long way in the last week. I think he's been maybe a little better than what he's gotten credit for the last couple of games, even before Monday. Miller is still kind of, up and down, but he was trying harder, I think I can say, on Monday. And Hughes was never struggled as much as the other 2, even though he's getting scored on a pile at 5-on-5, but he's also contributed a lot offensively. Some of those 5-on-5, it's bad luck. Some of it, the other night he makes a play he just shouldn't have made. But as he says, he can make that play 100 times out of 100, and he is a player with that kind of confidence. You want him to feel like he can make that play 100 times out of 100. As he gets older, he'll learn, even though he might do it 100 times, now's not the time for it to be one of those 100. But they do have to get more out of those guys. But it's not as simple as just them. But if they play better, it's going to help in a lot of other areas.
I'm glad you mentioned the Quinn Hughes press conference, because I actually like the way he's mature, he's articulate. He doesn't speak in cliches, and he's not afraid to say, hey, I think I've been playing pretty good. That was just a fluke play. So I find it kind of refreshing, actually.
I do as well. And you can tell these guys when you first meet them, you can tell the guys that have that it factor about them, that confidence. And it's not just brazenness or cockiness. It's that they really believe that they should be the best. They can be the best, and that they should be better than the guy they're playing against. And, you could tell that from Quinn Hughes right away. I remember talking to him the night he was drafted, saying he feels he's ready for the NHL. And then I talked to his dad, who's also a skills coach, professional skills coach, worked for the Leafs. So his dad does know something a lot more than you or I about the game. And I told him what his son had said, that he's ready to play. And his dad said, yeah, he is. You know, his defending probably still needs to get stronger, but he then talked about the things that Quinn does well. And of course, Hughes didn't play for another year, went back to school for another year. Turns out he could have played, you know, when he was 19. Elias Pettersson, it was clear to all of us that his first day at prospects camp in Penticton, the chip he was carrying on his shoulder. So there's lots of guys that have a chip on their shoulder about something, but it makes you pay attention and kind of try to decipher them a little bit, figure out what is this? Why is that chip there? Well, for him, clearly it was just because people had doubted him all the way to the NHL because he was, in his own words, skinny.
Yeah.
And yet he was this great talent who had not just succeeded, but absolutely excelled at every level on the way up. And he didn't feel it should be any different by the time he got to the NHL. You love to have those traits in players, especially the guys who are going to be your so-called franchise players. You want that in them. But I have to say, honestly, that's part of the reason I'm so perplexed about this start, because normally when guys are wired that way, they don't struggle the way they are now.
Yeah.
Like this is Pettersson's third season. It's Hughes' second. They're still very young players, but they are so driven. They are so determined to continue to improve and be the best. I didn't think that they would regress the way we've seen at times. These 16, they're not actually regressing, but the structure around them is so loose. They're struggling as well that it feels that way. But I just thought that they would find a way to push through this. I could see this kind of scuffle lasting, 5 games, 7 games. So I thought by the 10-game mark of the season, they would have it figured out. And whether they were good enough or not to pull the team back to playoffs, that remained to be seen. But I thought they would have it figured out and they would be firing on all cylinders. And so far they're not, but they're getting closer to it.
Right. Especially what you said about Pettersson improving. Absolutely. We'll do one more question before we do our wrap up. Do you think either Travis Green or Jim Benning are actually on the proverbial hot seat?
Well, I think they both are.
Yeah.
I just don't think that seat is going to get scalding at this point of the season, but it might. There's only the only person who really knows is Francesco Aquilini and his family members exactly how he feels, and he doesn't do interviews. Yeah. So I can't ask him, and I wouldn't expect if I could that he would be completely honest with me. But Travis Green doesn't have a contract, so by definition his team needs to perform, or he needs to show something as a coach to get that next contract. Jim Benning does have a contract, the GM, but he's been here. This is 7 years now, going on 7 years. That's an awfully long time for a GM.
Yes.
My biggest fear when he came over, because and Trevor Linden, of course, hired him. Linden was the first, then he hired Benning, was that they wouldn't have enough time to rebuild the team. Because they're really, a lot of people argue about this, about asset management and what was left. And listen, for sure, they made some mistakes along the way. They kind of had a false start to the rebuild by accidentally doing too well in 2015, and it sort of delayed things. It muddied their messaging about it. But from the team they inherited, if you go back, you look at the ages, you look at the contract, there just wasn't enough there to turn things around quickly, even though I think both Linden and Benning said that they thought they could be competitive and that this wouldn't take too long, which was a mistake to say. Maybe they were saying it because that was the mandate they were given by ownership to try and turn things around as quickly as possible. But realistically, this was going to take time. Now, I'm not suggesting that 7 years is okay for a rebuild, because it's been too long. That's why people were so euphoric with the playoff, what appeared to be a playoff breakthrough last summer, because it had been so long. But the fact of the matter is, Jim Benning has been given a long runway here to build the team. He has rebuilt a team, and it looks to have some really good pieces. But at this stage, they have to keep pushing forward. You know, he doesn't have the luxury of a terrible season. It's not year one or year two where you can have a terrible season and you'll still have time after. They have to keep pushing forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that that means he's a goner. And I just think right now, even though a lot of people would like, I think some would like to see change now. You know, we're in a pandemic. The border is closed to non-essential travel.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost impossible to make trades because of the salary cap, and also if you're on this side of the border, you're basically if you're looking for help, you need to get somebody from another Canadian team. Well, the Canadian teams are all playing each other. Nobody wants to help each other with the trade. I just think there's so little that a new GM or a new coach would be able to do right now. Like even from a coaching standpoint, there's no practice time.
Yeah.
I think the Canucks had 3 practices in the first 3.5 weeks of the season. And I may be overestimating that by 1. It may only be 2.
Wow.
Like there's not a lot a coach can do to retrain a team on the fly in a 56 game season. There's not a lot a new general manager can do to make moves to spark a team or to change the nature or the culture of the dressing room during a pandemic 56 game season. These are decisions, in my opinion, that are far better made with time and a degree of measure. Remove yourself from the emotions of the actual wins, or as we've seen lately, a lot of bad losses. Make a decision at the end of the year. Make a decision when you have a full field from which to hire if you're going to make a change. Because right now, if you're going to make a change, there's probably people that you might like who are working for other teams. So it's just better to wait until the season is over. I know it's frustrating for people who are so disappointed with how the team is done and they want to see change now. Realistically, I just don't think this is the time to do that. But again, the only people who know are Francesco Aquilini and his family. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Great perspective. Okay, and we're going to wrap up here. It's a segment I call the 5 hole for obvious reasons. 5 questions, but you can answer these as broadly or as quickly, one word, whatever you want to do. And I won't probe. You just say whatever you want. The first question is this. What's the sport that you most excel at playing, either now or in your glory days?
Track ball.
Wow.
Nobody knows what track ball is. Okay. It's like Frisbee, only more obscure. Soccer, MacIntyre. My middle name is Angus. Soccer was my first sport. I far from excelled at it. My brother was a pretty good player, played at UBC with the Celebrini brothers and Mark Watson and several other guys who went on to play pro. So my brother had the talent in family, but I guess soccer would be my first sport.
Awesome. And is that both for the sport you enjoy playing and the sport that you're most proficient at?
No, now I probably enjoy playing golf, maybe a little more than soccer, but I enjoy both. Anything that's exercise and gets me out of this office where I spend many, many hours is a good thing.
Awesome. I hear it. Number 2, you're starting a team from scratch. You're taking Elias Pettersson or Quinn Hughes?
Probably Quinn Hughes. I think it's harder to find that number 1 defenseman, the guy who's going to play 28 minutes.
Yeah.
But I would do everything I can to keep both. And I hope that the Canucks will.
Very cool. Number 3, you won't offend me either way because I'm half of each culture. We've talked about one of them. What do you prefer, Japanese food or Chinese food?
Can I go like Hughes and Pettersson? Because there's fantastic of both in Richmond.
Yeah.
Probably Japanese, like Ichiro and Steveston is my go-to place.
Very good. Okay, that's where we're going to go when COVID ends. Number 4, speaking of food, this gentleman, so you don't have to worry about paying. Who would you want to spend the most time with? Travis Green, Jim Benning, or Francesco Aquilini? Who are you going out to dinner with?
Probably Travis. Although Jim or Travis would be great. I probably actually talk to Jim more than I do Travis, so maybe that's why I would go out for dinner with Travis. I can
Yeah.
Try to get information from him. Maybe he'll tell me maybe he'll tell me for once who his starting goalie is going to be.
Love it. Love it. And lastly, and you can take a couple seconds to think about this one, because this often stumps people. What's one thing that people don't know about Iain MacIntyre that Iain MacIntyre doesn't mind sharing right now? What's one thing people might not know about you?
Okay. It's like in a good way or an embarrassing way, or
whatever way you want to take it, Iain.
Oh man.
And it could be trivial. It could be from the depths of your heart.
One thing they don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm drawing a blank because there's so many things I don't want anybody to know. How about the fact I garden? Love gardening. Grow vegetables in the summertime.
There you go. That's perfect. Well, Iain, thank you. So much good insight on a day where, we felt the tremors in especially you guys as media members. I appreciate your insight on that, on what it's like to cover the team in this crazy season, and your thoughts, very valuable thoughts on what this team can do to turn things around, which we all want the Canucks to do. So once again, Iain, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you both on the TV and reading your work on Sportsnet. So once again, thanks for your time.
Well, thanks, Clay. I've really enjoyed the conversation. But when you asked me, I told my wife about it, and she says, "Oh, I know him from Twitter. He's really positive." So you're the one. You're the one, are you?
I'm the one. Tell your wife she can join the GLCPC anytime she'd like to, and you can come too, Iain. Thanks again.
Thanks, Clay.